Canadian forces faced a sharp German response near Carpiquet. British troops probed toward Tilly-sur-Seulles. At Sword, elements of the 21st Panzer Division counterattacked, briefly reaching the coast between the British and Canadian sectors. But RAF Typhoons pounced, scattering the tanks and forcing the Germans to retreat. The first large-scale German armor thrust had failed. The Allies tightened their grip on the coast. Gold and Juno beaches were now fully linked. Infantry pushed inland under artillery cover. Mulberry Harbor preparations began at Arromanches. German reinforcements began arriving from further south, slowed by Allied bombing and French resistance sabotage. In Berlin, Hitler finally acknowledged the Normandy landings were real and not a feint. His decision to wait had cost him critical hours. The Allies had come in strength, and they weren't leaving. Americans from Utah pushed further toward Cherbourg, engaging German patrols outside Montebourg. At Omaha, U.S. units pushed through Vierville and Saint-Laurent. British troops turned their attention to securing the Bayeux-Caen road. Canadians battled for control of Bretteville and moved toward Carpiquet airfield. The air was thick with smoke and thunder. Allied bombers passed overhead in waves, hitting German strongpoints deeper in Normandy. The battle was expanding inland. Allied lines began to form a loose front. Engineers established supply depots just off the beaches. Medics treated the wounded in field hospitals, barns, and churches. At Pointe du Hoc, relief arrived for the battered Rangers. The guns had been destroyed. Their mission was complete. Along the whole coast, hedgerows turned into fortresses and farm lanes into kill zones. But the Allies kept pushing. The beachheads were secure. The land beyond was still being contested. Bayeux was now firmly in Allied hands. British forces pushed beyond the city, probing deeper into the Norman countryside. Canadians fought through rivières and advanced toward Puteaux-en-Bessin. At Utah, American infantry and airborne troops began clearing farmsteads and hedgerows in tandem. German artillery sporadically shelled beach approaches, but naval guns quickly answered. The Allies continued building their lodgment, supply lines flowing, bridges repaired, troops reinforced. And with each hour, the ground under Allied control grew. The German 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend began moving toward the Canadian sector near Caen, but their approach was slowed by wrecked bridges, resistance sabotage, and Allied air patrols. On Sword, the British dug defensive lines, anticipating further counterattacks. Omaha Beach was now bustling with logistics. Cranes offloaded jeeps and tanks. Bulldozers cleared wreckage. Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, reinforced at last, finally allowed medics to tend to their wounded. In the channel, the waves still came, carrying troops, fuel, wire, and hope. The Allies were ashore in force. More than 150,000 troops had landed. A continuous, if thin, front stretched from Sword in the east to Utah in the west. Near Gold, preparations for the Mulberry Harbor began in earnest. Canadian forces faced determined resistance from German positions west of Caen, now reinforced by SS troops. At Utah, American units pushed toward the town of Montebourg. The German 7th Army attempted to regroup, but Allied air superiority and disrupted communications left them guessing. D-Day was far from over, but the initiative now belonged to the Allies. Allied command consolidated gains. British troops outside Bayeux prepared to pivot southeast. U.S. units secured the heights behind Omaha. Supplies flooded the beaches, and roads into the interior began to take shape. At Sword, the British 3rd Division reinforced their positions near the Orne River. On Juno, Canadians pressed forward under fire toward Villon-le-Buisson. German armor prepared for a larger counterattack, but faced delays at every turn. The cost of hesitation at dawn was now irreversible. Rain threatened, but the landings continued. The 101st and 82nd Airborne worked to clear German pockets near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Chef-du-Pont. Engineers installed makeshift bridges over flooded terrain. On Sword, British armor formed up behind infantry screens. German commanders began redirecting additional divisions toward the front, but they were scattered, weakened, and constantly harassed from the air. Meanwhile, Allied command focused on the next objective, linking all beachheads into one continuous defensible line. At Omaha, American infantry began pushing toward Formigny and Trevière. Artillery and tank support moved inland. U.S. engineers opened new beach exits to ease the movement of supplies. Canadian troops in the Juno sector reached Puteaux and Bessin. Resistance intensified as German units used thick bocage and stone farmhouses to great advantage. Still, Allied momentum continued. With the beaches secured, the next phase was underway. Breakout would follow beachhead. D-Day was entering its final act. Defensive lines were dug across the Allied front. Command posts shifted inland and observation posts were established to coordinate naval gunfire. The first makeshift airfields were surveyed. On the beaches, tides brought more reinforcements, artillery, and fuel. U.S. forces at Utah moved against German defenses near Sainte-Mère-Église and began cutting routes toward Carentan. British command received word. The 21st Panzer Division was regrouping, but no major counteroffensive had materialized. The Allies now held over 60 miles of French coastline. Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were finally relieved in full, having held against repeated attacks for nearly 18 hours. At Juno, Canadian infantry engaged German armor near Buren in their first major tank battle. British forces near Sword braced for renewed contact with the 21st Panzer Division. On Omaha, engineers transformed chaos into order, laying roads, marking supply depots, building up for the long campaign to come. Thousands of wounded had already been evacuated, and many more prepared for the coming days. D-Day was becoming D+1. As dusk settled, the Allied front grew more stable. Scouts pushed inland, often alone, to map German defenses. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the 82nd Airborne prepared for possible counterattacks. British armor dug in outside Bayeux. German commanders held emergency meetings, trying to salvage a fractured front. But by now, the Allies controlled the air, the sea, and the initiative. Hitler, finally awake and enraged, ordered divisions to Normandy, but too late. The invasion had succeeded. The sun hung low over Normandy. Artillery duels intensified near Caen and Carentan. Allied destroyers repositioned for night bombardments. On the beaches, engineers used captured prisoners to clear mines. Canadian forces repelled one final daylight attack near their Juno lodgment. The line held. The front was firm. Medics continued working under fire. Chaplains moved quietly among the wounded. No one doubted what had happened. The tide of war had turned. The last major attacks of the day were turned back. Allied troops rotated into rest positions, where they could. Others dug deeper trenches and reinforced their lines. Patrols scouted forward into the bocage. At sea, the final wave of landing craft approached shore. Thousands more would arrive tomorrow. Allied command reviewed its first reports. 5 beaches taken. Every landing had held. The cost was enormous, but the result was undeniable. The stars emerged, faint behind lingering smoke. The front lines quieted, but never fell silent. Night watches began. German reconnaissance reported the truth at last. The Allies had come in full, and the Atlantic Wall had failed. Hitler's orders to hold ground at all costs became impossible dreams. On Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, thousands of men lay wounded or dead. But their comrades stood where they had fallen. The beachheads were permanent. Field hospitals overflowed. Wounded were ferried back to ships by stretcher and landing craft. In hedgerows and behind stone walls, riflemen whispered orders, listening for movement in the dark. Paratroopers patrolled crossroads near Sainte-Mère-Église. At the Orne, British commandos kept watch on the vital bridges. Allied logistics officers worked by lamplight, preparing for the next day's drive inland. Tomorrow would bring counterattacks, but tonight the beaches held. The last light faded from the western horizon. Men wrote in journals, smoked in silence, or passed out from exhaustion. Ammunition was rationed. Watch posts rotated. Supply crews moved quietly, dragging crates and fuel drums across gravel and sand. On ships offshore, commanders reviewed the scale of what they'd just done. A gamble had paid off. The longest day was not yet over, but the worst of it had passed. Across Normandy, from the Orne River to the Cotentin Peninsula, Allied forces held firm. Their enemies, many still waiting for orders, remained on the defensive. Armored columns meant to crush the landings had been stopped, delayed, or simply bombed out of existence. In towns behind the lines, French civilians dared to hope. On rooftops, some flew hidden tricolors. Liberation had come. Officers compiled casualty reports and intelligence briefs. Code clerks decoded fresh orders. Forward observers plotted targets for the morning. Graves teams marked the dead with simple stakes. On the beaches, bonfires burned to warm soaked troops. Rifles lay close to hand. No one trusted the night completely, but for the first time in years, Allied troops were sleeping on continental soil. The war had come home to Hitler's Europe. As midnight neared, darkness swallowed the French coast, but the Allies no longer moved in shadow. They were here, with armor, artillery, and air support. D-Day had claimed thousands of lives, but delivered a continent its first taste of freedom. From warships at anchor to foxholes inland, soldiers looked to the east. The beaches were behind them. Ahead lay the rest of France. 24 hours after the first paratroopers dropped from the sky, Allied flags flew over 5 sectors of the Normandy coast. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached in one decisive blow. Caen and Carentan had not yet fallen. The campaign ahead would be long and brutal, but the invasion had succeeded. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was over. Europe's liberation had begun.